And I say that because I think one thing that makes it we is that we pay for it. Right? He's in a position where he can help that payment, but so are we all. We are all in that position. And I raise this because we are also paying for things at home. We're paying for forces at home who are killing people.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to UUSF Forum. It's great to see so many people here today for our forum. And we have a great speaker for you today from the American Friends Service Committee. We've got John Lindsay-Poland, who's a really long-time activist who has a great message for you about police militarization. Before we get into that, though, just a few housekeeping things. So if you haven't been here before, the restroom is just off to the left over here. We obviously have a great breakfast for you over there. Please help yourself to that and coffee and tea. And for our Q&A, the way we like to run our Q&A is that you please write your questions down on the little note cards that you'll find on the tables and the chairs. And towards the end of the speaking, we'll collect those up and we'll read the questions from here so that our speaker can respond to them kind of collectively. I also want to mention the sessions that we have coming up over the next month or so. We have a forum every Sunday coming up here. Next Sunday is International Women's Day, and we'll have Barbara Nielsen. There will again be no Zoom for next weekend's forum. On March 10th, we have Fred Glass coming to speak about California labor history. And on 3/17, we'll have Calvin Welch speaking on San Francisco housing policy. Should be a good session. March 24th, we have Open Door Legal, which is a group that provides legal services to, I think, mainly indigent people. And then on April 7th, we have Stephen Zunes, professor at USF, coming to speak about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Okay, other logistical things. Well, we have a sign-in sheet at the door for the Human Rights Working Group and Forum, so if you didn't get an email about today's session and you'd like to be on our mailing list, please do sign that. And I think now we'll have our Ohlone land recognition. Willard?
Good morning. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribes, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First People. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous people understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor them and now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. And that last statement really resonates with me. I am an environmental professional working for the federal government. The Biden administration has reached out to the tribes and developed a policy on traditional ecological knowledge, where we work with the tribes to understand their wisdom in taking care of the earth and being stewards of the land. Due to climate change and process of changing habitats, tribes have indigenous knowledge over the centuries, and they've been working with the federal government, imparting their wisdom and helping us using Western science and traditional knowledge to protect the environment.
Okay, now before I introduce our speaker, I just want to share a little statement that we'll be reading each week going forward. It's a kind of a statement of intention for the Forum and the Human Rights Working Group about how we all interact in this space together here. So I'd just like to say this briefly. The intention of this presentation is to hear about various issues in our world today and provide a space where many ideas can be heard and discussed in an atmosphere of dignity and respect for all participants. Therefore, here are our expectations for the conversation. Please do not use language which may be interpreted as demeaning to the speaker, the audience, or other groups. Do participate by raising your hand to be recognized and identify yourself by name. There are also cards available for you to write a brief question and/or to state your opinion on the subject. Listen in respect to other points of view. Once you have spoken, please let others have a chance to speak, and if there is time, you may be called upon to speak again. And finally, if any problems occur during this event, we will pause the discussion and determine the next steps. So hope we all agree to these expectations as set out in the Society's covenants. Thank you for listening to that. Now I would like to introduce John Lindsay-Poland from the American Friends Service Committee. He's going to speak about police militarization, an important topic. He has been writing about and advocating for demilitarization, not only in our police forces, but in the world generally for 40 years. And I did mention that there's a sign-up sheet for AFSC at the door. Please do sign that if you'd like to be on their mailing list. I am on it, and there's a lot of inspiring stuff that comes out on that list. He co-authored a 2022 award-winning AFSC report, Equipped for War, Exposing Police Militarization in California. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce John to the podium.
Good morning. Good morning, good morning. There we go. Okay, thanks. It's really good to see you all this morning. Thank you for coming. I was sharing with some folks over breakfast that I was raised in a Unitarian society in New Jersey, and so I feel very at home here. And in fact, even when I was in high school, one of my first experiences as a speaker was presenting a Sunday service, a lay service in our Unitarian society. So I'm really glad to be here with you all. I know that the UUA has issued a statement, and there's a statement in front of this building in favor of a ceasefire. And Jeff asked me, are you going to say something about the connection between policing and Israel? Because, as many of you may know, Israel has a training program for overseas police. And in fact, I live in Oakland, and our county sheriff, our former county sheriff, went to Israel in 2004 and was so impressed by a training program there that he came back and he organized something called Urban Shield, which was an annual SWAT team training exercise that was inspired by what Israelis were doing. And so when I think about that now, many of you may have heard in the last week, a Republican congressman, Andy Ogles, said he was being confronted by pro-ceasefire activists and asked, well, what do you think? And he said, I think we should kill them all. Now, it's outrageous, and there are calls to censure Representative Ogles. But when I think about that statement, a lot of people may focus on the word kill, or they might focus on the word all. I'm interested in the word we. We should kill them all. Who is the we? I mean, Andy Ogles is not producing bombs. He's not doing anything in Gaza personally. We, what makes it we? And I say that because I think one thing that makes it we is that we pay for it, right? He's in a position where he can help that payment, but so are we all. We are all in that position. And I raise this because we are also paying for things at home. We're paying for forces at home who are killing people. And what is our responsibility in that situation? So that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. I want to start by remembering people who have been killed by the San Francisco Police Department. All murders are awful. All murders are a terrible loss. But when a murder is committed by a representative of a public force, We are in a very difficult situation, not only because of questions of accountability for police, but also because the police are the ones who are supposed to enforce the law, right? So it's a different situation when somehow the person who is the force, the agency that is being required to deal with violence is instead committing violence. So we don't have even images for all of these people. This was published by Mission Local, which I find to be a very excellent resource on many issues in San Francisco. And they, Mission Local, went through, and this is a link to it, and really created some memory for all of these people. Again, we don't have images of all of them. And I want to talk about a pair of people who were killed almost 2 years ago under the 280 pass down here south of Market. They were both men were homeless. One was in his 50s, one was in his 40s. SFPD was called because they were in a struggle, and one of them was armed with a knife. So SFPD officers arrived, and I'm not sure exactly how many officers were there, but quite a few, 8 to 12. And they began yelling commands because Mr. McFionigan had the knife, and Mr. Mendoza was trying to keep it away from him. And so for 10 minutes, they told McFionigan to drop the knife. He wasn't doing so. They fired, they used OC spray or pepper spray. Then they fired less lethal projectiles. And then they used their assault rifles. And they fired and they killed both men. Now, they did not use any de-escalation techniques. They were barking orders, they were shouting things at the two men. And it didn't work. You know, supposedly they had come to save someone, and instead they had ended up killing him. And I just want to remember that before we get into what can be a fairly technical or even analytical discussion of police militarization. In this case, officers used equipment, which is another word for weapons, you know, and often when I'm in these conversations with law enforcement and they call things equipment or they call things tools, I often want to ask, what is the difference between a tool and a weapon? And the difference is essentially the narrative. So we'll get to that. But they used at least 3 things that are regulated by a new state law: pepper spray, less lethal projectiles, and assault rifles. So, but let's take a little step back in history, because one of the things that I think is really important to consider is that militarization is relative and is typically predicated on racist perceptions or beliefs. So this is from the New York Times about 110 years ago. Probably many of you still read the New York Times. It's one of the few journalistic outlets to have survived the disaster that is journalism today. And in that time, there was a claim that black men who had ingested cocaine were immune to bullets, to .22 caliber bullets. And this was the rationale for Southern sheriffs to get 38 revolvers, which is a higher caliber, instead of the 22s that they had. Now, today, a 38 caliber handgun probably would not be considered, in the hands of law enforcement, probably would not be considered to be militarization because it has become part of. So it's all relative to what came before. And that's also what's happened in the last 2-3 decades, is we have seen an increase of militarization to the point that many law enforcement officials and members of the community don't see an assault rifle in the hands of law enforcement as a form of militarization. They don't see the use of rubber bullets or other projectiles as a form of militarization. They're tools. So, and in this case, of course, it was built on a racist claim. The same thing has happened in subsequent drug wars, whether we're talking about the Chinese and opium, whether we're talking about Mexicans and marijuana, whether we're talking about blacks and crack cocaine in different decades of the drug war. Because the drug laws started here in California in the 19-teens. And with each progression, they have been a basis for militarizing policing. So this is from a preamble to a law that was signed in 2021 by Governor Newsom. When we think about militarized equipment or militarized weapons in the hands of police, it is important to think about them as force multipliers. And that's actually a military term. The use of force by law enforcement, not just in San Francisco or California, but around the country, is disproportionately, there's a very persistent pattern used against black and brown people. So if you have a use of force and then you add into it a type of equipment or a type of weaponry that exerts greater force, it is a force multiplier. So the disproportionate effect of policing on black and brown communities becomes even more so when that law enforcement agency is more militarized and has more of these weapons at their disposal. We will hear, and you have on your ballot in the next week, I don't know how many of you have voted already, the idea that when there is crime, that we need to invest more in law enforcement. And this was a study that just came out earlier this month by the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, which looked at clearance rates by law enforcement. So a clearance rate is essentially when a reported crime has been solved, at least in the eyes of the law, typically through an arrest. And so the clearance rate is the percentage of reported crimes that have been solved with an arrest. And what we see is that the sort of jagged line going from the top left to the bottom right is the clearance rate, the average clearance rate in California for felonies, reported felonies. So that includes property felony crimes as well as violent crimes. And you can see that in the last 30 years, that rate has gone down. And in fact, in San Francisco in 2022, it was 6.7%. So 6.7% of reported felonies in San Francisco resulted in an arrest. We also hear sometimes that the prosecutors, Jesse Boudin, Pamela Price, are not prosecuting effectively. The study also found that during the same period, an arrest was more likely to result in incarceration over time. So even though there have been reforms in California that have reduced the prison population and the jail population, it is not because of lack of prosecution. And it is also not because of investment in policing. Because during the same period, we see an increase in the per capita spending on policing across California. And this is adjusted for inflation. So the greater investment in policing has actually had an opposite effect. And when we look at the reduced jail and prison populations, it's mostly as a result of two things. One is reduction in crime. And the other is a reduction in police effectiveness in solving those crimes. So that's, I think, an important background for all of our discussion about policing because of the narrative that is just over and over and over. And one of the things that I think is most important in the work around demilitarizing police is to engage in the narrative and to get non-police leaders to engage in a conversation about evidence, and a conversation about who should decide. Because so much of what we see in these conversations is civilian leaders deferring to law enforcement. Let's just let them decide. So we can come back to that. I want to just note that this information that I'm presenting is hard. It's actually toxic. So when we take in information about whether we're talking about Gaza or whether we're talking about what harms people do to each other, law enforcement or other members of the society and the community, if we don't do something about it, that information, that knowledge can just stay inside us. And if it stays inside us without anything to transform it, it can make us cynical, it can make us bitter, it can make us self-blame, and in other words, it can be toxic. So we need to handle it carefully and with intention. And my experience is that the more I actually do something with it, the less harmful it is to me to take in that information. The more I do, actually, the more information I can take in. And the more information I take in, the more I can do. So a lot of militarized policing, you might think of in relation to protests, right? Where you see the use of tear gas in a protest, or you see, in some cases, like during the George Floyd protests, the use of rubber bullets. But most militarized policing takes place either in SWAT deployments, so SWAT teams, special weapons and tactics teams of police, or in incarceration, in carceral facilities. And most SWAT deployments are being carried out. This is somewhat old information. It's over 10 years old, but there's nothing to indicate that anything has changed during those 10 to 12 years. That, like most policing, most SWAT deployments are carried out against black and brown households. This is why AB 41 was introduced in 2021. There were actually 2 previous attempts to regulate militarized equipment used by police that failed. This one did get through, along with some other legislation. There was another law that was also signed by Governor Newsom in 2021 called AB 48, very similar number, that highly restricts the use of chemical agents and impact projectiles or rubber bullets in crowd control. So that is in protests or other forms of crowd control. These are very important laws for having transparency as well as accountability to the community for what police are doing in militarization. So what does it apply to? AB 41 applies to drones and robots. I'll come back to that a bit. Tear gas and rubber bullets, also called impact projectiles. Flashbangs, which are generally they're called distraction devices, and they are used by law enforcement. They are very loud, very bright, sometimes also emit some kind of chemical agent or pellets. They're meant to distract someone while law enforcement moves in and does their thing. Then it also applies to assault weapons as defined by California law. You and I are prohibited from owning assault rifles, but law enforcement is not and has quite a few of them, as well as armored vehicles, and as well as what are called breaching devices, so things that SWAT teams use to blow open doors when they're going into some kind of building. And it applies to all law enforcement agencies in the state, state, county, and local, as well as transit agencies and school agencies that have law enforcement agencies. And it applies to all acquisitions of this type of equipment. So a lot of people think of Pentagon surplus, right? You may have heard about the 1033 program, which is a program by which the Pentagon, especially after the drawdown in Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of that stuff came home and was given to law enforcement agencies as grants. But this also applies to things that police buy. And what we have found through our research is that most of the stuff of these types of weapons and equipment owned by law enforcement is purchased by law enforcement. And so therefore, it's not free, and it's with the public dollar. So that's important. On the left here, when this law came into effect, this law requires that every law enforcement agency disclose what they have of that equipment, create a use policy for it, and that use policy must be submitted annually to the local governing body. In the case of San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors. In cities, it would be city councils. The Board of Supervisors then must have a hearing about those use policies. This is in Hayward, and it's kind of still during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic. And so this local community group, the Hayward Community Coalition, created a report card. The report card dealt with police militarization, but some other things that they cared about in terms of police oversight. And when each person came up to the mic during public comment, they said, "I'm grading you. We are grading each of you. Each of you members of the city council, when you say something about any of these 4 things, we're writing it down, and we're going to combine these and then publish our grade for you." It was actually quite effective. And in fact, one of the members of the city council at that time then ran for state senate, Senator Wahab. She is now the chair of the Senate Public Safety Committee in Sacramento and is a supporter of these things. And I think the education that the community did at that time was actually pretty important for her work now in the state Senate. So, like I said, we've done some research in American Friends Service Committee. We submitted, this kind of crazy, over 350 Public Records Act requests to more than 200 law enforcement agencies around the state. We wanted to get records about purchases of this military equipment, about deployments of it, and about policies for its use. And I don't know if any of you ever submitted a Public Records Act request. Different agencies respond with different levels of responsiveness. So about more than 80% of the agencies responded within 150 days. You know, the law requires within 20, but at least within 5 months, most of them responded by then. In the case of San Francisco PD, we had nearly 20 follow-up emails. There were 4 follow-up phone calls with SFPD in which the legal department of SFPD said, "No, you have to deal with public affairs." And the public affairs person said, "No, you have to deal with legal." And then the legal person said, "No, actually, you have to deal with public affairs." So they did not produce the information. In a little over a year ago, we sued them for the information. They did produce the purchase records that we requested. In the case of records of deployment, so we were looking for any kind of record of how they have deployed rubber bullets and chemical agents primarily. And they gave us a list, and in their cover letter they said, "We are excluding from this list any incidents that involve minors or mentally ill subjects." We had not asked for any information about minors or mentally ill subjects, or even who the subjects were, who was involved, which means that if we were to appeal and say, "No, we actually want information on every single incident," they would be disclosing which ones involved mental health subjects, mentally ill people, and juveniles. It was a runaround to not disclose all of their incidents in a very subterfuge kind of way. So in the implementation of this law, there are things that have been made more transparent. One example, in Long Beach, I don't know if any of you recognize this, it was in the Long Beach PD's inventory for years before the law came into effect. In this case, it's a surveillance tower camera that can move all around. Of course, we have that pretty pervasively here too. And but it would not have been known about. There was no information about it until AB 481 required at least the knowledge of it. There was an NDA that Long Beach had signed with the provider saying you can't disclose it, and this law overrode that NDA. So at the very least, you can get some transparency around it. Similarly, in Sacramento, this is a type of equipment. It's a kind of a combination between a bulldozer and an armored vehicle. And in the loader, you have these guys, and it has little portholes where they can stick out their assault rifles while they are moved around. It can also open up a house, or it can lift a car or a vehicle. It's pretty intimidating looking, and at the very least, this made it more visible and raised the whole conversation about the acquisition of the Rook. And again, getting into the conversation is at least half of the struggle. Having a conversation, because most of the time, civilian leaders in the community are not aware and often don't want to have that conversation about militarization. So let's take a look at San Francisco Police Department. And in the case, so AB 481 required every law enforcement agency to submit to the governing body and to publish use policies for its militarized equipment by May 1st, 2022. San Francisco was late, but they did submit one, May 16th, 2022. And what they submitted, which goes to the Board of Supervisors, right? There was no assault rifles listed at all, as if they had no assault rifles. And I can guarantee you they have assault rifles. Almost every law enforcement agency of any size in California has assault rifles. Even if they only have 30 officers, generally they have some assault rifles. Then, and you can see, then in September, they submitted a revised policy and they listed 687 assault rifles. And you can see that's part of what they listed, and including 15 submachine guns and a few other fully automatic rifles. Then in November, they redlined that policy, sent it back to the Board of Supervisors, and this time they deleted all of their assault rifles. Now, there is a provision in AB 41 that explicitly lists assault rifles as militarized equipment that are subject to oversight. But there is, what it also says is, except standard issue service weapons. And in the syntax of it, it sort of sounds like they're talking about handguns, because it says all special firearms, including assault rifles, except standard issue service weapons. Many law enforcement agencies have used that phrase to say, oh, well, our assault rifles are standard issue. So they deleted all of them. Then, and this is all in a back and forth between Supervisor Peskin, who was at the time, he wasn't the president of the board, but he was chair of the Rules Committee where this policy was going. Then in late November, the military equipment policy was amended to say, oh, actually, we have 312 assault rifles. And their rationale was that the chief of police conferred with members and confirmed that these weapons have remained standard issue service weapons as they are procured by the department and issued to members. So by that logic, anything that is procured by the department and issued to members, they were contrasting this with law enforcement who privately obtain their own assault rifles. There is a provision in state law that allows a cop to get an assault rifle and use it during duty. And they were saying, well, that's not how these were obtained. But by that logic, anything that is purchased publicly, that includes the submachine guns, would be a standard issue service weapon. It really makes no sense at all. Now, during this whole time, in the fall of 2022, there was a discussion about robots. San Francisco PD has some robots. And as I said, law enforcement has invested very heavily in robots and drones. So unmanned, the idea is let's reduce all risk for law enforcement apart from the risk for other people. And initially, they didn't put any provision in the use policy about whether they could be used as a force option, meaning could they be used to spray tear gas, or could they be used to fire something or to explode something? Supervisor Peskin, actually at our request, asked, because in Oakland, we had the same conversation about a robot that the Oakland PD said, well, we want to use this as a force option too. And the Oakland Police Commission had pushed back, and the Oakland PD had said, oh, okay, never mind, we're not going to do that. In the case of San Francisco, Supervisor Peskin asked, are you thinking about this as a force option? And SFPD said, yes, we are. We want this actually to be a lethal force option. In other words, we could use the robot to kill people, only in certain situations, only in extreme situations. And then the supervisors in the first reading in early December, or late November, I guess it was, of 2022, approved that policy. But in the meantime, the idea that law enforcement would have killer robots became an international media scandal. And also within the city, people began to say, what? We're going to have killer robots? And so then the supervisors, in their second reading, reversed in December. Very important decision by those supervisors, and very much due to the mobilization of many people who showed up at City Hall and called their supervisors and emailed and so on. It does work. I want to mention another experience of citizen mobilization, in this case in Santa Cruz, because in Santa Cruz, the Santa Cruz PD did something similar with assault rifles, where they said, these are standard issue, even though bike cops don't carry them, and people who, cops who are on foot don't carry them, but these are standard issue, so we're not going to declare them. We're not going to include them in the policy, which means there's no use policy, there's no publicly accountable use policy, there's no information about how many they have or how much they cost, and there's no reporting on their use. So the Santa Cruz City Council, responding to community mobilization, used a provision of the state law that says you can add other things to your military equipment requirements. That is, you have a list, the state law has a list of types of military equipment, and a local governing body can add something to it. You could add tasers, you could add other things that are not included in the state law. So the city council in Santa Cruz said, okay, we're gonna add assault rifles to this. Whether or not they're standard issue or not, we want to know about them. And that's it's such an important piece of that conversation between community and law enforcement in order to have some accountability, is to actually have, there's a whole doctrine about civilian control of the military, right? You don't really, the countries that have military heads of state or who allow the military to run military operations without any kind of civilian oversight that's democratically accountable are more authoritarian. And similarly here, if you have law enforcement that has no accountability, that has no way for local civilians who are part of the community or elected by the community to say, this is the kind of policy we want. The issue here is, in assault rifles, most people, I don't know about the people in this room, but most people would be okay if law enforcement had an assault rifle that they would only deploy in situations of active shooters. Most people would be okay with that. But if the policy doesn't say that's the authorized use, then they can be used anywhere. They can be used to serve a drug warrant. They can be used when there's suspicion of something weird going on. And that is what occurs in many places. So when we talk about militarized equipment in AB 481, we're not just talking about acquisition and possession, which is often what law enforcement wants to talk about. They want to say, well, you think we should have this, right? Because if we don't have this and we need it, then we're really screwed. But really what the governing body, what the Board of Supervisors is considering is use policies. And that is a function of civilian oversight and governance. Policy. Policy should not be written by the people who implement the policy only. Most of these policies are actually drafted by law enforcement, but there needs to be some civilian accountability for what that policy, because it's about where's the line? Where's the line between when it's okay to use and when it's not okay to use? And the community has a very deep stake in where that line gets drawn. I want to mention a couple other things that we are campaigning on. One is a particular kind of weapon that we call scattershot. So these are less lethal impact projectiles, but they have the characteristic that they are a munition that has multiple projectiles in them. So that could be like the thing on the right over there, the sting ball, typically is thrown, and then it explodes like a grenade, and they're usually called grenades. And then many pellets, could be 30, could be 150 pellets, go in all these different directions, three-dimensional directions. And so or it could be fired from a launcher and have multiple projectiles going from the launcher and then dispersing in a radius, which means that they're indiscriminate. And the producers, the manufacturers of these weapons themselves say, do not target, and state law also says, do not target the head, the neck, the groin, or the thorax. In many demonstrations in many countries around the world, these are used. The United States is an exporter of these weapons. And people have been blinded, people have been killed by these weapons. So we think that, and law enforcement has so many other tools, which we mean weapons. They have single-shot projectiles, they have chemical agents, they have the flashbang grenades. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has called for prohibiting these weapons for law enforcement, and we think they should be prohibited as well. San Francisco PD and the San Francisco Sheriff's Office do not have them, but our Alameda County Sheriff's Office has more than 700 of them. And so we are trying to get our county supervisors in Alameda County to say no more of these. Second sort of campaign that we're working on has to do with jails and prisons. And when we did the research on the number of times that militarized equipment is used by law enforcement across the state, we found that by far, these weapons are used in prisons more than anywhere else. So every month, in the 32 prisons across the state, impact projectiles and chemical agents are used hundreds of times. And so we're wanting to make that more visible. We're gonna issue a report a little bit later this year about the use in jails and prisons because it's so hidden. It's literally behind the walls. And it's very difficult for someone who is incarcerated to actually denounce it, right? To bring it out into the public sphere. So it's up to us to do more of that. We're trying to do that through Public Records Act requests and interviews with people. It's also very difficult to interview people who've been subject to this. And in fact, one of the things that we've learned is that, so this is a graph over time. You can see that there's a growth over time and just in the last 2 or 3 years. And the red is pepper spray, the purple is physical force, so body force, but then the green is impact projectiles. And that's every single month, that's by the month. And you can see physical force is used 700 to 800 times a month. The other piece of this is that most of these uses of force in California prisons, more than 75%, are against people with a mental illness. And that's also true in jails, that there's a high proportion. Why? First of all, many people who with a mental illness are incarcerated. The percentage of people in cages in this state and in many parts of the country who have a mental illness, and often because they have a mental illness, they can't cope with the demands of the society, and so they run into conflict, or they become homeless, and homeless people are criminalized, or they start medicating using drugs, or they have a co-occurring drug disorder. Then they get incarcerated, and once they're incarcerated, their mental health gets worse. So, and everything about jails and prisons is around command and obedience, right? So it's about compliance. So most of these uses of force are about how do we get the people in jail and prison to comply. That could be something as simple as go back into your cell or come out of your cell. Or it could be you have to take medication. In Santa Clara County, where San Jose is, there is authorized use of tear gas for people who refuse to take their medications. So this is something that is not visible, and we want to make it visible and begin to question, of course, the incarceration of people with mental illness, but also the use of violence against people with mental illness. I want to mention just a couple other things before we go into a conversation that American Friends Service Committee is doing. In Alameda County, our Board of Supervisors passed a policy 2 years ago called Care First, Jails Last, recognizing that between a third and a half of the people in the county jail have a mental illness, frequently a serious mental illness, and they should be getting treatment out in the community. They should be getting housing. They should be getting upstream preventative services instead of their health deteriorating. They're cycling in and out of psychiatric hospital, jail, homelessness. So, of course, the budget has to follow, and that's the harder struggle. But we're part of a coalition, and there's other efforts around the state also to provide Care First and Jails Last. We also have a campaign. At the moment, it's an individual pledge to think twice before calling the police. It doesn't mean never. It means think twice. It means deconstruct your own decision process. Why are you calling the police? Are there other ways that you could address whatever it is that you want to address with the police? Are they the right people to bring to the situation? Is there some other kind of professional or community neighborhood resource that you could bring to the situation? Does it require, will it do more harm than good? Even if you think it's something that requires attention, does bringing police in where it's not only what police do on the spot in the moment, it's also the fact that the system is not really healing the injustices or the wrongs that people do to each other. So someone's arrested, they go off to prison. The person who's been harmed in the offense, in the crime, is often not better off. And in fact, you have people who are going into the system who are worse off, whereas there's nothing happening to there are people who want a restorative justice process after being wronged, after being harmed, and they can't get it in the current system. So that's one reason why we also are building up, as much as we can, restorative justice processes. That can begin in our community, where not with a criminal offense, but where we get used to dealing with harm through a circle process, through something that it's a way of living and not just a legal remedy to something, and a way of dealing with the ways in which people do harm each other. And finally, we have, an American Friends Service Committee, created our own kind of North Star. This is aspirational, and this is about all of the things that I've been talking about. How do we replace these systems of incarceration, of policing, of violence, with systems that are healing, that when people come back into society from being in prison or in jail, they are part of the community again and get the services they need, where people who are harmed also get the services and the attention that they need, and where we also have the the budget, the resources to help people stay healthy and housed, rather than falling into illness and a much more difficult life situation. So with that, I will, this is some of our contact information. I do want to say, actually, one other thing. Which is that San Francisco PD is required after, so this policy for military equipment was approved by the Board of Supervisors in December of 2022. It went into effect 30 days after that in January of 2023. Within 12 months, San Francisco PD is required to post an annual report on how its members have used military equipment. That report has not yet been issued. And so we are working with Dean Preston's office, and we highly encourage you to say something to the Government Audit and Oversight Committee of the Board of Supervisors, as well as to the Police Commission, to say, we're interested in this report. We want to see this report. And the report should comply with the state law and what that report, includes. That's, I think, an important piece, because the report will also be accompanied by a request to renew the police department's policy for military equipment. And as we saw, that policy excludes hundreds of assault rifles from its policy. So there needs to be a conversation about, and there's an annual process. So it's not done, done and done. And I recently watched the Police Commission's public comment period, and it's mostly people who are saying, you Police Commission people, what is your problem? Shouldn't there be a stop and frisk policy that has thousands and thousands of vehicle stops, traffic stops? It's important for people who have a different perspective to get in front of the Commission and to get in front of the Board of Supervisors and say what we need in order to make our community healthy and safe.
Thank you so much, John. I would like to have another presentation someday on the North Star with AFSC's vision for a better way of living. It sounds like that would be like an independent topic that would really be enlightening to us, so thank you for that. I have a few questions, and if folks in the room have more questions, do please jot them down, and I'll get to those in a minute. Here's the first one. It's great to see you again. Your knowledge is comprehensive, and Karen wrote this question. I find the responsibility of the police to protect is very similar to the responsibility of an occupier. I believe this is a reference to the Geneva Conventions, which state that an occupying power has responsibility basically for the safety of the people who are being occupied. So whether it is based in Israel or by proxy, the USA, is it not true that the occupier is legally responsible for the well-being of the occupied and freedom of self-determination of the same? Are the police
I think
legally...
there is a legal difference, because it has to do with sovereignty. So San Francisco has a measure of sovereignty which it delegates to a law enforcement agency for enforcement, for protection. In the case of, say, the occupied territories, Palestinian territories, that doesn't exist, right? Because the occupying force is not representing the Palestinian people. It's representing the Israelis. So I think that is an important legal difference. In practice, it's often the same. And certainly many members of our community see the police as an occupying force because of the way they behave. And I think maybe the common piece here is around accountability, right? When somebody does something wrong, when a law enforcement agent or a member of the military does something wrong and hurts people, what is there to hold them accountable? Who will hold them accountable? And that's up to us. I really think that law is an important tool, but it is not, I don't take it as a given that it will always be followed by the state or by anyone else. And so it becomes up to us as a democratic force to ensure that when a wrong is done by someone acting under the law, with the face of law, that we hold them accountable, and that often requires something more than just you followed the law, right? It needs to be, no, this was wrong apart from the law.
Okay, here's another question. This is a quote we often hear spouted or said by the pro-gun lobby. If guns are outlawed for the police, then only outlaws will have guns. How do you respond or feel about that statement?
Whose question was this? No, I'm serious. I want to speak to you, whoever it is. Oh, yeah, it's okay. You don't have to raise your hand. Well, you know, I actually think that in this current moment in our history, a complete disarmament of police without a disarmament of members of our community would be a bad thing. Because in our society, we have 400 million firearms in our country. 400 million. And they are heavily concentrated among white men. Heavily concentrated. So you have an industry that has been catering to white men who are increasingly white supremacists, right? Many of the collectors of guns, people who want militarized guns, who want AR-15s. Not all, you know, probably not even a majority. But there is a concentration of white supremacists and the gun culture, right? They're going together. If you look at the people who are going down to the border now who say we're going to enforce the border, they are very much involved in the gun culture. They've made their connections through the gun culture, and they are heavily white supremacists. So we're in a very difficult situation. I do think that what this law does is provide oversight. And we can also take a look at, okay, what are the situations in which you say, I'll give you an example. In Sacramento, one of the things activists are calling for is saying, you are overstocking because you are stocking millions of bullets of assault rifles. In what situation are you going to use millions of bullets? You're not even using a fraction of that for training. So again, it's the conversation about armaments that we need to have. That opens up the further question about how we make each other safe.
Thank you. A related question, have any jurisdictions measured whether disarming the police increases police on-duty deaths? Maybe a related question would be, would it increase civilian deaths? I don't know.
I don't think I said anything about disarming police. But, so it's interesting, like, again, this is the way law enforcement frames the question. Do you want to disarm us? Right? You want us to be defenseless? You're going to send us out against people who are armed with nothing to defend ourselves? That is the framing of law enforcement. And what we're saying is, it's a question of degree, and it's a question of transparency, and it's a question of accountability. Those are the three things that we are looking at here. And so, yeah, you know, there are definitely other countries that are where law enforcement is less armed than police, right? So England being an example, for example. Of course, the society is also less armed in England. So again, we're in a difficult situation. I think that the fulcrum, perhaps, is accountability for when police do use their firearms and fire them upon people. What happens? We have, you know, I'll give you another example. The rationale often for the so-called less lethals, which can kill people in certain circumstances, is otherwise we would have to shoot them. But also without the context of whether the person who's going to be fired upon is firing on someone else, right? So sometimes it's, well, they were dangerous. This is why policy is so important, because you define what is the level of threat that justifies a violent intervention. And then you get into a conversation about when is state violence justified. That's an important conversation that we rarely have.
Okay, next question. This person might not have been here at the very beginning when you kind of addressed this, but can you explain the relationship between the Israeli military and/or police and U.S. police? Are U.S. police trained by the Israelis? Is racism involved? And I would like to tack onto this a mention of the Cop City project in Atlanta. What are they involved in that?
Okay, and can I say thank you? So, yes, the Israelis do have a police training program. It is very difficult to get information on. There's been some information that has been acquired and published by Jewish Voice for Peace, but it's been very difficult to get, any kind of comprehensive amount of information. Is it racist? Well, the mission of Israeli police, who are often the ones who are carrying out this training, is a racist mission against Palestinian people, I would say, in my opinion. There are, in what I described before, there are instances of U.S. law enforcement, including the former sheriff in Alameda County, Gregory Ahern, going to Israel, getting training, saying this is great, coming back and trying to set up the same thing here. Jeff was asking about Cop City. So police get training, and actually a lot of reforms, people are calling for more or better training. Police are trained. The question is often how much training and what kind of training. How is that training, how does it visualize whatever threat law enforcement is going to be dealing with? And that was what was, when Ahern set up this Urban Shield program, that was part of the big objection, was that the threat was conceived as protesters, was conceived as Muslim, was conceived as people coming over the border, and that becomes indiscriminate. In the case of Cop City, so this is a project in Atlanta that is to set up a law enforcement training facility, very large, on a forested area in the city, mostly black area of the city, that would cost at least $80 million and would be used to train other law enforcement agencies outside of Atlanta, perhaps even all over the country. So because of resources, right, and we saw how much resources are being used for law enforcement. Law enforcement gets a lot of resources in our cities and counties. And also because of the lack of accountability of Atlanta police, and also because of the use of a forest to destroy a forest in order to set up a police training facility, there's been widespread protest at what is called Cop City in Atlanta that's drawn solidarity from all over the country. And is also, in response to that, Atlanta and Georgia have indicted people for providing bail for people, for people who are doing nonviolent protests, have imprisoned people for carrying out protests, have attacked some protests. And so there is solidarity all around the country. We've been part of some of those efforts to make visible, because a lot of Cop City is being supported by corporations. It's being supported by Home Depot and UPS and Chick-fil-A. And so just a few weeks ago, we did something at the Home Depot in Emeryville just to call attention to this and to try and get the corporate sponsors to say, actually, this is not such a great idea. And in fact, after that series of protests, which happened in several cities around the country, the representative of UPS called one of our staff and said, "We'd like to have coffee with you. The money that we put into this was not for that. It wasn't for that facility. It was for something else." So a kind of a distancing from the project, which we think is a good thing.
I'm filling in for Jeff. Can you tell us, what are your thoughts about Proposition 1 relative to addressing mental illness?
Prop 1 is a state proposition that has been promoted by Governor Newsom that would move funds within the Mental Health Services Act, which is sometimes called the Millionaire Tax, And it would require more of those funds to be used for supportive housing for people with mental illness. But it would also take away funds from preventative services. So it gives counties less flexibility in how those mental health service funds are allocated. I think that's not a very good approach because it doesn't really add much to the pot. There is some additional money in there for the construction of mental health facilities, which is a good thing, but in my view, doesn't require moving things around. Yes, more money is needed for housing, no question. And the housing first model, I think, makes a lot of sense for many people with mental illness. But I think it's legislation that I have very mixed feelings about because it constrains counties in what they're able to do.
Why is there so much glamorization of police in this country? You have shows like Law and Order, CSI, Criminal Minds, etc. Why do we love cops so much? What need does that serve?
You know, this would be a great, Jeff was saying we could do another program. That would be a great program because I would love to hear what everybody here has to say about that.
Can you just answer that in 10 words or less?
I mean, we're also a society that glamorizes war. And, I think a while back I looked at the 10 top grossing movies and 8 or 9 of them were all about war and violent conflict. And so we're a society that is obviously committed to violent conflict around the world. We're an imperial society. We're a settler colonial society. And so, maybe it reflects that. But we're also a society that creates those media for the rest of the world, right? We are creating that glamorization for the rest of the world, which many people are also following. Why? I mean, I guess a lot of people think if we can only get rid of the problem, if we can only obliterate the problem, we'll be okay. We'll be okay. Like, isn't that the happy ending we're looking for? Like some kind of problematic person or entity or force, and we put a bad picture on it, right? It looks really scary, and then we have somebody, a hero, get rid of it. It's so satisfying. Because then we're safe, right? Right? Aren't we safe then? So I think it's very seductive. I'm not going to say I've never watched a cop program or a war movie, but it has its impact.
A few years ago, there were...
That's true, absolutely.
A few years ago, there were a series of highly publicized police killings of Mario Woods and others in San Francisco. This provoked a huge outcry. Since that time, have police been more restrained, or is it business as usual here? I haven't sort of measured SFPD's violence quotient, if you will, over this period of time. I think it's something that tends to go up and down in cycles. And I do think that the way San Francisco PD gets its way is by allying itself with the crime narrative and then saying you need us, but then also frequently not doing their job, right? So that ergo a 6.7% clearance rate for felonies in the city. But whether the number of incidents of violence by SFPD or the number of killings by SFPD has gone up or down, we can refer to that Mission Local series to see how many per year have occurred. John, we really appreciate you answering our questions. Your presentation has been great. We've got 2 more questions. How are we doing on your time frame?
I have to go.
Okay.
You can do those and then I gotta go.
Okay. Is it correct that the FBI has jurisdiction in cases of police misconduct? How much faith should we put in the FBI?
I don't know that. I think it would have to be a special jurisdiction for FBI. They would have to be invited in.
So, typically the county DA, there's layers, right? There can be an internal thing within the agency, which usually is not very effective. Then the county district attorney has responsibility for any kind of criminal prosecution. And then California Department of Justice does have authority to come in and investigate, should they choose to do so. I don't think they have to be invited in. But Cal DOJ can also come in and investigate police misconduct.
The notorious Israel lobbyist Jeffrey Epstein was interested in an electronic Trojan horse device tied to 911 use. Do you have a position on the use of such devices?
I don't really know what that is. But I do know that Israel is developing, one of the ways that Israel both imports weapons from the United States and other countries. Germany and the US are the primary ones right now. But it also exports. It produces and exports weapons. And one of the selling points of its exports is that they have tested them. And of course, they've tested them on Palestinians. And so that includes, the sort of kinetic war weapons, like vehicles and bombs, but it also includes cyber and surveillance technologies, which have been exported to many parts of the world, including where I'm going this afternoon, which is Mexico. But, and used against journalists, against political opposition, and so on. So we actually, in our American Friends Service Committee, we have a project called Investigate. I think it's investigate.afsc.org. And we have been, especially since October 7th, we have been documenting, along with other researchers and advocates, the use by Israel of imported weapons as well as their own, and in order to support actions and efforts by people who are trying to rein in the genocide by stopping the weapons.
I really want to thank you for all your tremendous presentation and your excellent answers to our questions. We really appreciate you joining us for Forum. This afternoon, we're actually doing a screening of Also Happening: Violence and Oppression in the West Bank. That's sponsored by the Human Rights Working Group and Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East Bay Chapter. So it was very interesting that you connected your presentation with a lot of the things that are on our minds. I definitely want to thank you so much, John Lindsay-Poland, for your great presentation.
Thank you, John. And I do want to ask, I will follow up with anyone who signs the AFSC sign-in sheet over there. I am about to leave within 5 minutes, but we will follow up on whatever is going to come before the Board of Supervisors and the Police Commission about militarization in San Francisco. So please do add your name and email there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, let's all think of going before the Police Commission as well to help the AFSC push these agenda items, right? John mentioned coming back to this room at 12:30 for that film about violence in the occupied West Bank. And do please come again next Sunday when we'll have a presentation on for International Women's Day. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at 12:30, hopefully, and next Sunday.
And I say that because I think one thing that makes it we is that we pay for it, right? He's in a position where he can help that payment, but so are we all. We are all in that position. And I raise this because we are also paying for things at home. We're paying for forces at home who are killing people.